Start. Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Mendoza. I am a teacher in the English program at PUCV. A warm welcome to the 7th of 8 presentations of our webinar for ESL and EFL teachers at PUCV, Digital Learning and Teaching, Promoting Students' Autonomous Learning. This presentation will last approximately 30 minutes. During the presentation, you can write your questions to our speaker using the Zoom chat, which will be answered during the 10 minutes allotted at the end of the presentation. Next, I would like to introduce the speaker of this session, Dr. Elaine Schmidt. So, researcher who has focused on cognitive aspects of language processing and language learning using eye tracking and EEG or electroencephalogram. She obtained her PhD in phonetics and bilingual language acquisition from the University of Cambridge, where she explored language acquisition in simultaneous bilinguals and the role of ambient language in both production and perception. After her PhD, she worked on cognitive processes of L1 and L2 speech perception in Sydney, Australia. Here, Elaine also combined eye tracking and EEG to explore similarities and differences in speech perception and reading, specifically the processing of subvocal prosody in reading. Elaine then moved back to Cambridge, where she researched and taught in the linguistics department at the University of Cambridge. A few years later, Elaine decided to combine her research with more practical applications and joined Cambridge Assessment, where she brings her expertise in speech production and perception, eye tracking, and EEG in second language learning to an assessment context. Without further ado, I leave you with Dr. Elaine Schmidt, who will talk about how language learners process speech, cognitive aspects of speech processing in non-native perception.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Nicole, for the very great introduction. And thank you for having me here. I'm really honored to be presenting here. Is it okay if I share my screen? All right, let's do that. And could you let me know if you could see my screen? I can't see any of the chats. Can you see my screen? Okay, I assume that's a yes. Right, so I'll be talking about the cognitive processing involved in listening. Now, the title might have sounded a bit complicated, but I will try to talk you through this in relatively simple terms. And of course, if you have any questions, do let me know. I'm happy to answer them afterwards. But if we don't have enough time, I'm also always happy to answer emails. So if you have any further questions, you can always contact me there. Now, listening in an L2, so in a second language or in a third language or fourth language, is arguably one of the most difficult skills. Why? Well, because it requires the listener to do multiple things at the same time. On the one hand, it means that the listener has to decode information rapidly. So while, for example, in writing or in reading, you can pause, you can maybe go back to earlier sentences, and even in speaking, you can pause yourself before you continue with your speech. In listening, you don't have that luxury. In listening, you have to decode information rapidly. You can't pause unless it's a recording, but not in natural speech with another speaker. You then need to access the meaning of the words that you hear, and you need to fill in gaps immediately. So this is basically a guesstimate, not an estimate, but a guesstimate. You have the best guess based on the context. Now, normally we assume that as we listen to language, we basically hear every single word, but that's not the case. Very often what happens is that we just hear some of the words and we fill in the rest relatively quickly so that we didn't even notice that we didn't hear everything. If you speak a foreign language and if you've ever been to a crowded, noisy environment like a bar or a pub somewhere and you listen to an L2, sometimes you feel that you're asking a question, you're asking the speaker to repeat, and by the time they start repeating the question, you've already understood, or they start repeating the sentence, you've already understood what they meant to say. So at that point, your brain has already filled in the gaps. It just took a bit longer, and it generally takes a bit longer in an L2 than in an L1. And of course, it depends on the level of proficiency. The more proficient you are, the more quickly you can fill in these gaps. Then you need to integrate the meaning of the individual words into a sentence. So making sure that the sentence structure is right, making sure that the sentence actually means what you thought it meant. And this is often while the speaker already continues with a new sentence. So it might be that you reach the end of the sentence and you think, oh, actually my first interpretation wasn't quite right. You need to reinterpret it, and the speaker already says the next few sentences. So you need to have multiple things in your mind at the same time. And possibly, of course, while you're listening to us, you might be mentally preparing a response instead of just listening to everything first, then thinking about what you're going to say and then saying it. So you can see that the combination of these is very, very difficult. But even if we only look at the first one, even if we only look at the decoding, this can be very hard, especially in a second language. So how does decoding work? Well, we normally talk about the difference between bottom-up and cognitive processing and top-down cognitive processing. And we use a combination of both of these whenever we listen to speech. What does bottom-up processing mean? It means that we hear each sound as it comes in, and then we select relevant entries in the mental lexicon. So let me give you an example. This is the same principle, but you can see it now written down. So for example, you hear the sound F. What happens is that you select all of the entrances in your vocabulary that start with the sound F. Now here you can see this is actually from a dictionary, so you have some nonsensical entrances at the beginning, but here you start with fable, fabo, fabi, and so on and so forth. So you have any kind of entrance that starts with the sound F. Then the next sound comes in, I, and you can see that the list now is already a bit reduced. You start only with ones that actually start with these two sounds. And as more and more sounds come in, so sh, here is sh is one sound, sh, you can see again the list is being reduced until at some point there becomes the point where the next bits don't make any sense anymore. So if you have something like Fisher, in the British pronunciation or the American pronunciation, you can see that things like fishful, for example, are already at that point not a possibility anymore. So at that point, you know that you have reached the list. And then as soon as the next sound comes in, the M, you already know this is the uniqueness point, it's fisherman, and that's it. So this is what we call bottom-up processing. So one by one, you hear the sounds, and then you arrive at the right meaning of the word. And of course, this happens really, really quickly, so you aren't aware of what it is that you're doing. But what we're also doing is top-down processing. So top-down processing means that we use any other relevant contextual or syntactic information that can help us arrive at this meaning earlier. So if I'd, for example, said, I don't know, I caught this massive fish, and I've had loads of practice doing fishing because my father is a, and then I say fisherman, then at that point, the context is already narrowed so much further that you probably arrive at this meaning before you've even reached all of the steps in bottom-up processing, just because this is what makes sense. So this is what we call top-down processing. And we use a combination of these two, bottom-up and top-down processing, when we process speech. But bottom-up processing in L2 can actually be quite challenging. Listening to each sound coming in sounds relatively easy, but it is actually quite challenging. Now consider, for example, these examples. And the question is, can you hear the difference? So we have eel versus ill. We have bud versus bard versus bad versus bed versus bid, and so on and so forth. Now these differences sound really simple to me, but I know that for Spanish speakers, so I've tried to only use differences that are actually quite, from experience and from research, show that they are a lot harder for Spanish speakers. Whereas these differences should be very easy for them. Fan versus tan, pay versus say, pan versus ban. These are differences that are very simple. So why is it that some contrasts are quite difficult? Now we have to do kind of a tiny bit of phonetics here, but don't panic, I'll talk you through this. What you see here is a representation of your mouth. So this is basically the face on the side, and you can see the shape of the face. I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but my cursor is currently pointing at the nose. Then you have the lips, the teeth, this is the tongue, and then you have teeth and lips here. And what you see in the middle is called the vowel quadrangle. So basically the idea is that this is the space where all of the vowels, any of the world's vowels, are produced, and it's only in this one space. So if you want to simplify it afterwards, what you use is basically a shape that is in this quadrangle, and then you can plot all of the different vowels that actually exist in a certain language in there in order to analyze them. So if we do the same thing for Spanish, then what we get is something like this. You have 5 vowels. So this is based on Castilian Spanish, I should say. I don't know enough about Chilean Spanish, but I believe you have the same number of vowels. But actually what happens is that sometimes the actual presentation, the actual realization of the vowel is slightly different. But basically what this happens is that you have these 5 vowels and the realization differs every single time you mention them. So for example, if you have the E sound, if you have something like cerveza, then the first E isn't exactly the same as the second E, but they're somewhere around this triangle. If we compare this to English vowels, you can see immediately that that's a massive difference. We have 11 different vowels in English, and this is again in standard British English, not in American English. We also have 11 vowels in American English, but they look slightly different. Now, what does this mean for the learners? If we consider the contrasts again that I mentioned previously when I said some of them were hard and some of them were easy. Well, look at the hard ones, eel versus ill. If we look at the distinction that we have in English, it is a distinction that doesn't exist in Spanish. Instead, what happens is that the realization of this vowel, because in Spanish, sometimes the vowels also happen to be slightly longer, happen to be slightly shorter, but this difference isn't meaningful. And that means that the space that you have in Spanish only is linked to one contrast, one sound, whereas in English, that space is basically split up into 2 different types of contrasts. If we look at the example of but versus bad versus bad, this becomes even more complicated. You can see that there are 3 different vowels at the bottom. Don't disregard the 4th one, but there are 3 different vowels at the bottom for but versus bad. And you can see in Spanish, there's only 1. And this is part of the problem, or this is the big reason why, for example, many Spanish speakers struggle with these contrasts, because these are contrasts that don't exist in their language. So they might naturally produce sounds that are more like an a, more like an a, or more like an ah sound, but this difference isn't meaningful. And because this difference isn't meaningful, it is very, very hard for the brain to hear them as different types of sounds. So, as I said, there is variation in the productions of all sounds within the space. That is the case for all different languages. But a language determines whether this variation is meaningful. So if we think of this variation as a continuum, because it is a continuum, sometimes you have your tongue slightly higher or slightly lower, so you produce a slightly different sound, then it depends on the language to determine whether it is 1 unit or whether it is 2 different linguistic units or 3 different units, and so on and so forth. And that's what we call perceptual mapping. So we map it onto units that we have that are meaningful in our native language. So what does this mean for L2 learners? Well, if there are new contrasts, the initial state is that you have too few categories. So if you have the example of the a, for example, you only have 1 category initially, and you don't have enough categories to fill up the rest. Whereas if you have existing contrasts, so for example, if you look at the difference between pan versus ban, Spanish actually produces the per and b slightly differently. But because you have the same contrast between what we call a voiced and a voiceless sound, you have the same number of categories. The perceptual task then means if you have new contrasts, you need to create perceptual mappings, and you need to integrate these auditory cues. Whereas in existing contrasts, you can just adjust your perceptual mappings and those category boundaries. So for example, in the per b example, you realize very quickly, oh, hang on, they actually do pronounce it slightly differently, but they still have this binary distinction that I also have. I shift my category boundaries and you'll be fine. The representational task then means that you need to create these phonetic categories and you need to create new segments. Whereas if you have existing contrasts, you don't need to do anything. You already have these phonetic categories. So this is what the L2 learner needs to do as they encounter new phonemes. Now, this is, of course, not as they listen to speech, but as they learn the language. This is the very, very beginning stage when they learn a language. So if Spanish learners, for example, learn English, this is what they would do with the vowels and with the consonants. New contrasts are, of course, then very difficult because you need to do more things. You need to create perceptual mappings, you need to create phonetic categories, and you need to create segments, whereas existing contrasts are not difficult at all. I should warn you though, if you look at different studies, you can see here that some studies have found that actually similar sounds produce the greatest challenge, so what I've just mentioned, but some studies have found that they're actually not. So these claims sometimes in the literature are diametrically opposite. Why is that? Well, it's because people have defined similarity as different things. Sometimes they've looked at qualitative descriptions of articulatory phonetics, so how exactly it is produced in the mouth. Sometimes they just looked at the acoustics. So if you think of a spectrogram where you look at the waveforms and then you look at how similar they are, they look at perceptual comparison or perceived similarities. I think for simplicity's sake, and I think this is the one that's generally seen as the most accurate one, is if we look at a perceptual comparison. So ill and eel are perceptually very, very similar. And so they are a lot harder to learn in a foreign language, whereas dissimilar sounds are a lot easier to learn. So dissimilar sounds, I couldn't think of examples in Spanish where you have sounds that are so dissimilar that they would be very obvious. Maybe the r and r. But that isn't even, I mean, that's still relatively similar. If you think of clicks in African languages, for example, they are so different to anything that we have in European languages that it's very easy for us to say, yes, that's a new category, and I form this new category. So does this depend on age? You often hear that the younger you learn languages, the easier it is. Is that true? Yes, but I don't think that people necessarily appreciate how young you need to learn a language for this to be completely true. Now, if we think of babies, newborn babies, it is true. They can hear all different types of sounds. They can hear Chinese tones, Zulu clicks, any kind of vowels, anywhere that exists anywhere in the world. So a baby, it doesn't really matter where it's born, they have the capability to learn any kind of language that they're exposed to. But they actually start to lose the sensitivity really early. They start to lose this in the first year of their life. And that's because the sounds that they are exposed to aren't useful in their L1, so they don't need to be able to distinguish between them. So if you, for example, think of a baby that's growing up in Spain, well, they very quickly learn that the variation that they hear in the R sounds isn't meaningful. And so they don't need to be able to distinguish between them, so they don't. And that frees up cognitive space, that frees up mental capacity for other things. So it is useful for them to stop doing this. So they learn what the normal variation for sounds is, and they map these all to a sound category. Now, that doesn't mean that L2 learners can never perceive these sounds. They can, the only problem is it takes a lot of time. So in a way, it is true if you start earlier, you have a better chance, but not because you are still able to perceive all of these differences, but just because you also have more time to learn this, but also because your brain is a bit more plastic. So you have new, so what we call brain plasticity, you can form new connections more easily, and that means you are able to learn this more easily. But it is not true that an L2 learner can immediately perceive all of the different sounds if they're, for example, 5 or 7, and if they learn the language. Now, I have shown you that the perception of sounds is clearly really important for bottom-up and top-down processing. And this is in order to arrive at lexical items fast. If you remember, I said at the beginning, you need to be able to decode the information, and then you arrive at the lexical meaning of words. So you hear the different words that are said in a sentence. But the sounds aren't actually the only thing that is important, even though most language teaching focuses only on sounds. The other thing that is important is prosody. And prosody, at least in Germany, where I'm from, wasn't taught at school at all. I don't know what it's like in Chile, or I think most of you are from South America, whether you teach prosody there, but in Germany, this wasn't a thing at all. So what is prosody? Well, prosody contains quite a lot of different things, such as lexical stress. So if you have the example that I've given you here, there's a difference between display and display. One is a noun, the other one is a verb. But it also contains sentence melody, amongst other things. Now, I'm going to show you a few examples to show why these are also important if you listen to somebody speaking English, but the same holds true for any other language. Oh, right, sorry, I should say they're really important because they help top-down processing, and I'll show you know why. Now, if you look at this example, it doesn't really work when it's written down, I admit it, but it does work when listening to it. So if you listen carefully, he likes to display his skills versus He likes 2 displays for working from home. He likes 2 displays for working from home. Now, before you've reached the S in sentence B, you should already have been able to hear the difference between display in A and display in B, even though the other words sound exactly the same. And that information, that difference in stress, whether I've stressed the first syllable or the second syllable, shows you whether it's a verb in A or a noun in B. So it's the lexical stress that distinguishes between the two. Now, as you can see, it's not strictly speaking crucial for comprehension because the meaning does become clear later on. As soon as you reach the S, for example, you know, well, actually at that point, it can't really be a verb anymore in sentence B. And then you hear the rest of the sentence and then you know, anyway, it needs to have been a noun. But do you remember what I said initially about how you need to reintegrate? You need to integrate the words into a sentence while the speaker might already be producing new sentences that you might then lose. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So if you've first misunderstood which of the 2 words it is, display versus display, then it means that you've analyzed the sentence wrongly in your mind. And that means that you slow down in how you interpret the sentence, and you might be led into a garden path, and then it slows you down in trying to understand the next few sentences. So it takes precious resources, mental resources to get back on track, and you might lose new information because you simply don't hear it, or because you can't process it, because you're still trying to make sense of the sentence that you've just heard. So this is an example of lexical stress. I'll show you another example with boundaries. Now, if you see the sentence just the way that it is written, it can have 2 different endings. It can have the ending of A, fell down. It can have the ending of B, the child was playing. Both are syntactically completely fine. Now, when you read the sentence, normally you would place a comma. You don't have to, but you would normally place a comma to help the reader. In speech, of course, you don't have that luxury. What you have to do in speech is you produce a boundary. So if you want to say A, you would say, while the man was reading, the book fell down, versus B, you would say, while the man was reading the book, the child was playing. So what you do is you produce what's called a prosodic boundary, either on reading or on book, where you lengthen the word, where you put a different pitch on it and a different intensity in order to demonstrate that there is a boundary and to show how the sentence continues. So the interpretation of reading the book, of that bit of the phrase, depends on where the boundary is placed, whether it's reading the book or reading the book. So this is done with pitch, duration, and intensity. Now, while all languages use the same cues, the way that they use the cues is language specific. So Spanish does it slightly differently to English. English really makes use of lengthening quite a lot, whereas Spanish doesn't. Spanish plays a lot more with pitch. So it is something that language learners need to learn. And they often struggle with this. I don't necessarily know why. Maybe it's because they haven't been taught at school, but this is what we find in our studies consistently, that they really, really struggle with prosody. As you can see, it is again not strictly speaking crucial for comprehension, because you can arrive at the correct meaning later on, but of course it leads the listener on a garden path. And it again means that it takes precious resources to get back on track. If you need to arrive at the end of the sentence in order to know whether the book was the object to reading or whether the book was the subject of a new clause, then it means that, again, this takes away processing power that you can normally spend on the next sentence, and so information might be lost because it's not heard or not processed. I'll give you another example where boundaries really now distinguish between meaning. So there's no other information here. If you have this sentence, there are 4 different types of readings that you can put into this. And I deliberately don't read out the sentence before I show you the options. I can either have that option, so these are supposed to be skirts, I couldn't find a better picture, where you separate blue from the green and red. It could be where blue and green belong together and red is separate. It could be one with 3 different types of colors, and it could be 3 different ones with 1 color each. Now, the correct meaning of the sentence is very, very obvious in the prosody when this sentence is spoken, but there is no other information otherwise in the sentence. So if we want to have meaning A, we would say, I bought a blue and green and red skirts. If we want to have B, I would say, I bought a blue and green and red skirts. C, I bought a blue and green and red skirts, versus D, I bought a blue and green and red skirts. I don't know whether you can hear the difference. It is relatively obvious to me. It may or may not be to you. That might actually be quite interesting to know. What you can see in this example is that the interpretation only depends on where the boundary is placed. Again, as in the other example, this is done with pitch, duration, and intensity, but how this is done is very language specific. Different languages use the cues differently. And as I said, L2 learners often struggle with this. Importantly, there is no other information in the sentence telling you which interpretation is correct. So while I said in the other ones, it's not strictly speaking crucial, in a sentence like this, it is. There's nothing else that helps you otherwise. So prosody really is crucial here. I have to admit there aren't that many examples where no context is available, but there are some. And the some mean that maybe we should be focusing a bit at least on prosody. So it makes sense for us to focus on teaching sounds and low proficiency learners, absolutely, but maybe in high proficiency learners, especially if you have learners when they try to reach C1, C2 levels, they really should learn about prosody as well, because it is an integral part. And it's not just, of course, for listening, but it's also for speaking. And if they can't perceive the differences, then it's very difficult for them to produce the differences. And that, of course, then has an impact on the interlocutor if they don't know what the person actually meant. So what have I done so far? I've given you a brief overview of some of the cognitive aspects of listening in L2. I should really say that this is only a brief overview. There are many, many different types of dimensions for this, but I try to also keep it relatively simple. I hopefully haven't used too much vocabulary or too much terminology from phonetics or from EEG that you weren't familiar with. I hope I've demonstrated why learning to perceive some sounds is really hard, but this is very much language dependent. So as I said, the examples that I've used are all based on Spanish versus English learners, but of course there are many examples depending on which languages you look at. If you have a Spanish learner learning Chinese, for example, that's a very, very different story. Of course, there it's not just the types of vowels, the number of vowels that are important, but the tones and so on and so forth. So teaching in different countries benefits from focusing on what is hard depending on the L1. So it doesn't really work to have a one-size-fits-all approach. What is hard for German learners is not the same as what is hard for Spanish learners. And I hope I've shown you that learners use both bottom-up and top-down processing, and that this top-down processing, or the combination of these two, especially is done at higher proficiency levels. So in a way, it shows you how proficient a learner is if they can integrate these different things very quickly. But top-down processing really needs to be helped with the bottom-up processing of prosody. So as much top-down processing as you want to use, if you don't use prosody in a bottom-up fashion at the same time, you still will never properly reach something like a C2 level, because you still have problems processing certain sentences, and by that definition also producing these sentences. And that's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions. I don't actually know how long I've been talking, so I have no idea because I can't see the time. Hang on, maybe I'll stop sharing. Oh, 28 minutes, that wasn't too bad. It's almost exact.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt, for such a wonderful and interesting presentation. We will now proceed to read some of the questions. So to all the attendees, please remember to write your questions in the Zoom chat so Elaine can answer all of them. We have one from Valeria. It says, would you suggest we correct our students' sounds from the very beginning they start learning English, or should we focus more on the fact that they can communicate and make themselves understood?
I think this question, I think there are two different aspects to it, and one is production and one is perception. For production, yes, it is absolutely about communication. So maybe for production, you don't want to focus necessarily completely on these sounds. But perception is a lot harder. And for perception, you may want to focus on exposing them to the contrast as much as possible. I said in the talk that L2 learners can in time differentiate between these sounds. And the important thing is exposure. You need to expose them over and over and over again to these differences so that they realize this variation is variation that's meaningful. Because you have, as I said, the same variation in Spanish naturally, but it's only if you demonstrate that this variation creates a difference in meaning for their listening, then they will learn this. And then at some point, you might be able to either continue with that in your productions, in their productions, or maybe at that point, because they're able to hear these differences, they're already able to produce these differences by themselves. So yes, I think for production, I would take a more communicative approach, but I think for listening, if listening is taught separately, and I think in a way it should be, I think exposure, exposure, exposure.
Thank you. We have a lot of comments. It says very interesting presentation. Thank you. Eliana says sentence stress is relevant. For example, in the sentence, and she writes, I didn't say we should kill him. Depending on the stress we use is the meaning that we have.
Yes, that's a very good example. So this is another one where intonation makes a difference. And in this case, it's pragmatic meaning. So the sentence, in a way, the sentence syntactically doesn't change, but of course the pragmatic meaning very much changes depending on where you put your sentence stress. And again, this is slightly different in different languages. And you have, for example, differences in pitch range between different languages. German speakers are known for having a relatively narrow pitch range, whereas English speakers have a larger pitch range. So the differences that German speakers produce sometimes get lost for English speakers because they think, well, they clearly didn't accentuate it enough. I'm afraid I don't know enough about about the Spanish pitch range to know where they fall there, but I can imagine that it might be similar.
Carolina Seed says, how can we effectively teach prosody in low proficiency learners?
I think in low proficiency learners, it might be very difficult. And I think in low proficiency learners, as I said, it might be worth focusing on sounds initially more because they need to know the vocabulary, they need to know the syntax. Prosody is something that usually comes at a later stage. I mean, at the beginning, basically what you do is when you hear a speech stream, you're lucky if you can pick out some of the words if you're low proficient learners. I have to say my Spanish is very rusty. It was never very good, but it is very, very rusty. So I just try to pick out words that I know. I don't care at this point about prosody. So I think for low proficient learners, it's better not to focus on this because at that point it's not very useful. But I think at a higher proficiency level, you may want to.
Thank you. Emily Guevara says, is it okay to correct its students as they make the mistake? That means to interrupt them or wait for them to finish.
I'm not sure I'm the most qualified person to answer this question. I have to say, I'm not a teacher. I am a researcher. So from a learning perspective, I don't know. I mean, correcting in a way is useful. At the same time, from a motivational perspective, maybe if they're corrected all the time, it's not helpful for them. And as I said, I think for production at the beginning, you can get away with more because you want them to be able to obviously communicate. I think for perception, it is really important that you get these differences at the beginning right so that you can then use it for production. So I'm sorry that I can't completely answer this question, but I'm afraid I'm not an English language teacher.
Okay, but we have more questions, a lot of questions actually. Sandra says, does it help them if you speak slowly all the time?
At the beginning, yes, absolutely. And you can see this that foreigners will also try to accommodate, or native speakers will try to accommodate to foreigners as well. What you very often have is not just that they try to speak more slowly, but they also really speak loudly, and you think it's a bit obnoxious, but it is actually helpful. It is helpful to slow down, and it is helpful also in a way to speak a bit louder so that the contrast becomes a bit clearer. And then, of course, as you move forward, as you become more proficient, that difference should disappear. And I think, to be honest, even in listening exams, if you do them at lower levels, for young learners, for example, you typically have slower speech. They do speak a lot more slowly than they would have in an exam that's for C1 or C2 learners.
Thank you. Dimi Riojas asks, have schemata, context, previous knowledge, form lexical words played an important role on the top-down process, and various and other strategies to consider?
Sorry, would you mind repeating the question? I didn't hear the first bit.
It says, have schemata, context, previous knowledge, form lexical words play an important role on the top-down process, and if there's another strategy to consider?
I mean, top-down processing considers many different things. It can be, for example, context, but it can also be syntax. So yes, absolutely, these things do play a very big role, and you do build schematas. I mean, the thing is, if you are in a context, for example, of this webinar where I've just talked about the difference between the languages, if I use something like phonetics, you use top-down processing, you don't need to hear the whole word from me in order to understand what I mean. So if I, for example, say phonetics, you still know that this is what I said. You don't need to be able to hear all of these things. And that can be in many different forms. In a way, what we actually also very often use when we talk to somebody face to face, and that many people aren't aware of, is the mouth shape. So this is another information that we use. And this is why I think many language learners find it so much harder to speak on the phone, because you don't have this additional information, because you can't see what they're saying. So there's a lot of information, a lot of strategies that we subconsciously use that we aren't completely aware of, that help us arrive at the correct meaning.
Thank you. We have two questions that are kind of related. Maritza asked, what about if we use translation methods? And Rocco says, hello, I have a question. In my case, I am from Argentina. So for those who recently start learning English, so they know nothing about the language, is it okay if I start teaching them the structures in Spanish and in the future start to speak in English with them?
Again, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this, because I'm not a language teacher. I've had possibly very different approaches in Germany. In Germany, languages are only taught in the foreign language. So for example, everything we've heard in English, so when I learned English, everything was done in English. Nothing was done in German at all. And I know that in the UK, they do it differently. I'm not sure I know of research that shows which one is better. I think, as I said, generally exposure is good. But of course, if they don't understand in the first place what you're saying, then maybe you do need to switch languages. But this is something that a qualified teacher would be better able to answer instead of me.
Thank you. You could also share from your experience, so that's amazing as well. Jose Alfredo says, very interesting and brilliant presentation and very useful. Thank you so much from Colombia. I wish this kind of presentation will repeat again, because it's very important and it's a brilliant motivation for us and our students.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind. Yeah, the recording is available, so you're I think able to see this again. But if you want me to give the same presentation to other teachers, do get in touch. I'm happy to repeat it if you think it might be useful. Obviously, I'm very happy to help.
Noelia Oliveira says, how can we adjust this to our current way in communicating wearing face masks?
Yeah, it's a big problem because suddenly we don't have all of the facial cues. We don't have any of the cues that we normally get from our mouth. It is similar to speaking on the phone. It is not impossible to obviously hear the other listener at that point. It just makes it a bit harder. I mean, we are able to manage, obviously, because we were able also to communicate on the phone, but it does make it harder, and it will certainly also make it a bit harder for non-native speakers, that's for sure.
Vanessa Salazar asks, I had a doubt about analytic and syntactic phonics. What the difference is? Phonetics, maybe she means.
Sorry,
analytic
about syntactic?
And syntactic.
I'm not sure whether I know what analytic phonics is.
Well, we have lots of positive comments. Really interesting webinar. Thanks for sharing all the information. Great presentation. Thanks. Some questions repeat. Absolutely useful. I think that would be it for now.
Well, thank you very much again. As I said, I'm happy to also be contacted by email if there's still any questions that are open. I'm happy to answer them. And thank you so much again for inviting me. It was a really big honor for me to be here, and it was a fantastic 2 days of presentations. So thank you. It's really great.
Thank you so much once again for your amazing presentation and for all our attendees who participated and sent their questions. We remind you that at the end of the 2 days of presentations, you'll be able to download the diploma of participation. And before we go, we invite you to join us with our next and last speaker, Mr. Pablo Toledo, who will show us Cambridge resources for teachers at 3 p.m. following the link on our website. And maybe I can share the link with you here in the chat for you to access there. Thank you, Daniela. So see you at 3 p.m. Thank again and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Bye. See you later.